everyone. I'm Will Goodwin from VoteVets, and I want to welcome you to our VoteVets Live Memorial Day Remembrance event. Every year on Memorial Day, we stop to honor the memory of the men and women of the U.S. military who lost their lives while serving our country. From the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Vietnam and the mountains of Afghanistan, American troops have paid the ultimate price in service to the rest of us. Today is about telling their stories and honoring their memories. But of course, this year looks a little bit different with COVID-19. We aren't able to visit loved ones at Arlington or share stories of the fallen at events in small towns across the U.S. But instead, right here, we're going to have a conversation to remember and reflect on our fallen heroes and talk about what today really means. And I'm honored to welcome two great Americans who are Gold Star family members themselves to help us do that. Karen Meredith is the mother of Army First Lieutenant Ken Ballard, who was killed in action in Iraq. And since Ken's death, Karen has been a tireless leader and advocate for Gold Star family members and veterans across the country. And Paul Eaton is a retired U.S. Army Major General, and his father, Air Force Colonel Norman Dale Eaton, was killed in action in Vietnam. Karen and Paul, welcome, and thanks to you both for joining us today.
Thank you, Will.
It's great to see you both, and it means a lot to us that you're here and that you're willing to share about your loved ones. We're going to start by talking a little bit about each of their stories. We'll talk about how you typically honor them on Memorial Day, and then we'll reflect and get some advice on how we can do it in this new reality. And to everyone watching, if you have a question for Karen or Paul, feel free to comment on Twitter or Facebook, and we'll pass some of those along to Karen and Paul in just a few minutes. But without further ado, Karen, I want to start with you. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and about Ken's story?
Well, welcome everybody. It's good to be able to talk about Memorial Day today. I'm Karen Meredith. I live in Northern California, and it was 16 years ago on Memorial Day that my son was killed, First Lieutenant Ken Ballard. And so I'm just trying to figure out how to honor him. Ken was the kind of child that would draw tank battles on his homework. And so there was no doubt in my mind that he would end up joining the military somehow. Ken ultimately was a fourth generation Army officer and loved being a tank commander. So he was one of those guys that would just lighten up the room when he walked in, and you knew there would be an adventure.
Thanks, Karen. And typically on Memorial Day, what would you be doing to remember Ken?
Well, we didn't plan it this way, but Ken is buried at Arlington, which I some days second guess that because it's so far away from me, but I've always been able to visit the cemetery once or twice every year at least. And so the first year we just invited people who might have known Ken. My family was there, and every year Team Ken is a different number of people. Every year also there's been somebody new that I didn't know was going to be there, but who knew Ken either from college or from the service. And last year I was able to meet the medic that took care of Ken the night that he was killed. So it's always a good day. It's a hard day, but it's a good day. And this morning a friend of mine called me and FaceTimed me, so I got to sort of be virtually at Arlington this morning. But I'm kind of lost this year because I really need to be surrounded by the people that knew Ken and that loved Ken. But I guess I'll get through it.
Thank you, Karen. And Paul, I want to ask you the same question. Your father died while serving in Vietnam. He was also missing in action for a period of time. Could you introduce yourself and tell us about your father and his story?
Sure, Will. Thank you. My background, I was an Air Force brat. Grew up all over the United States and Europe in an Air Force family, and pretty much a foregone conclusion that I'd follow my father West Point, and served in the infantry for 3 decades, and have been associated with VoteVets for over a decade. As for my father, 1949 graduate of West Point, came out of Oklahoma, small town, and wanted to fly fighters all his life, which he did. And first aircraft was the P-51, flying at Nellis Air Force Base, and then moved on to a variety of jet interceptors over time. And in 1969, he was requalified and earned a position as command pilot in Vietnam, the Yellowbird Squadron, the 8th Tactical Bomb Squadron, flying the B-57. Their job was to fly at night. They would leave Phan Rang Air Force Base in Vietnam, in South Vietnam at the time. And on 13 January, he had a mission to interdict the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the main supply route for the North Vietnamese Army going into the south, as it wandered through Laos. He executed that mission, and while providing close air support with what he had left for offensive weapons on the aircraft to U.S. forces on the ground, his aircraft exploded, presumably from ground fire, given what Joint Task Force full accounting discovered. Well, he went missing. That was the term for almost 35 years. And in 2003, I got a message when I was serving, commanding the Iraqi Army project in Baghdad, that a young archaeologist had discovered a dog tag in a tree that had washed out, which became the primary vector to give the team an opportunity to collect the remains that eventually would be identified as my father and as his co-pilot, Paul Getchell, ultimately both buried in National Cemetery at Arlington.
Thank you, Paul. And Paul, as you alluded to, there's actually a task force people might not know about within the U.S. military that has teams all around the world working to bring home American heroes who went missing in action. Could you tell us a little bit more about that process and then what it meant for you and your family because of their work to have your dad back on American soil?
Indeed. So when Project Homecoming was underway in 1972-73, I was in Ranger School, and very little contact with my mom other than through the tactical officer that I had for my unit in the school, who stayed in comms with my mom, very grateful for that. And he did not come home. Very few came out of Laos. Most of the repatriation of our POWs came out of Vietnam. So the United States, and this is a demonstration of leave no man behind, leave no person behind, put together a joint task force with all the skill sets needed to be able to find the aircraft or find the position of the lost soldier, airman, sailor, Marine, and to excavate the site and to recover whatever remains may be found, with an effort to identify with mitochondrial DNA picked from a blood relative on the female side. And that team would then bring the remains back to Camp Smith in Hawaii, where they have a lab that eventually, if the soil and time has been kind to the remains, they will be able to do an identification. When they get an ID, that bone fragment or remain that they are able to identify becomes the body. And the team was able to put together a body evident for my father and for Paul Getchell, his co-pilot. And when that happens, whatever is left is put into a common grave. So you have a grave for each primary, and then effects that are not claimed and possible human remains go into a third grave, a common grave with both names on it. So when you go to the National Cemetery and you see a tombstone with more than one name on it, that's essentially what happens. Sometimes you get as many as a dozen if a gunship goes down or any other large event. So that's what our country has elected to do: leave no person behind. And I am very, very grateful, as was my mother, because it happened before her death. She was able to bury her husband, and with my brothers in attendance, and with my children. So that is something that we can all be very proud of.
Thank you, Paul. I mean, it's a remarkable story, and it speaks to how important that work is to bring closure and bring people home to their final resting place. Now, for those of you who are just joining us, we're in the middle of a Memorial Day Remembrance event with Gold Star family members Paul Eaton and Karen Meredith, who have been so nice to join us from the West Coast today. If you have a question for either Karen or Paul about Memorial Day or about their experiences, please leave a comment on the Facebook live stream or enter it into the chat on our Twitter Periscope. Now, Paul and Karen, you both talked about Arlington National Cemetery. Arlington is, of course, the final resting place for so many of our nation's heroes. And this year, because folks aren't able to go visit those loved ones in person, I want to talk a little bit about Arlington. And Paul, if you could start by just describing for people who haven't had the chance to visit Arlington, what is the place like, and what does it feel to be on those grounds?
It's truly holy ground. It is a lonely place in most sections. My father was buried in section 67, but the joint burial site for Paul Getchell and Norm Eaton is in section 60. And shortly after my father's funeral, both the individual and the collective, my wife and I visited section 60, and there the scene was very much different. It was Memorial Day, and it's a very powerful site and opportunity to witness. Family members young, family members older, sons, daughters, wives, husbands, parents, gathering at the gravesite. And we've seen remarkable scenes of the newly aggrieved family members. And I urge everybody, given the opportunity, to participate in a number of things that happen at the Arlington National Cemetery. The posting of flags, the Christmas wreaths around America. There are volunteer opportunities there. I guarantee you that the experience will live with you forever. It will be positive, but you will also have a sense for what so few have done for so many in this country.
Very well said. Thank you, Paul. And Karen, I want to ask you the same question about what Arlington means to you and how you describe it to people who may not have had the chance to be there themselves.
Well, I had never been there before Ken's funeral. And so, but being raised in the Army, I always felt that there was some comfort in every grave is the same. Every headstone is the same. When my father was stationed in Germany, we traveled quite a lot around Europe, and there was something very pristine about all of the headstones over in the cemeteries in Europe. And so it seemed like that was the right place where Ken would be buried. and so he was. To me, and Paul explained it really well, Ken is buried in Section 60. Section 60 is called the saddest acre in America, because that's where so many of the Afghan and Iraq casualties are buried. So it's a very young, the people that are buried there are very young. And so you'll see little kids running around who have never met their father, mother. You'll see parents. We're really a family. We have a tree that's in the next row in front of Ken that we put Christmas ornaments on. I don't think the administration likes that very well, but too bad. We get to do what we want to do, and as long as they don't mark up the graves, the headstones, then I guess we're okay about it. But to me, it's one of my Gold Star friends said she thought Arlington was kind of scary, but for me, it's just so it's just America, and it's the sacrifice that so many have given to this country. And I knew that Ken would always be taken care of if he was buried there.
Absolutely. Thanks, Karen. I mean, and it's also a place where you get to see how much the U.S. military and the people working there in the old guard care about the ceremony and making sure that everyone receives the honors that they've earned through their service. And it's just an incredible thing to watch those ceremonies take place. Now, Karen and Paul, I want to transition. We're going to talk about some advice for other Gold Star families and all Americans as we mark Memorial Day. Karen, you've been a leader and an organizer and helped a lot of other families who went through the same experience that you did. I'd like you to just talk a little bit about what your experience has been getting to know so many of your fellow Gold Star family members and what you've learned from them.
Well, Ken was killed very early on in 2004. He was the 100th soldier from California to be killed in Iraq. And so we kind of had to make up the rules as we went, because I don't think the country was quite prepared for the casualties that were coming so fast and furious. And there were a lot of things that they hadn't prepared for. For instance, families were not allowed to go to Dover Air Force Base to welcome home their loved one. And that became quite contentious, but that became a big cause for me. And finally in 2009, when President Obama signed the agreement that families could go to Arlington, I was told that go to Dover. I was told that Dover was a tarmac, it wasn't a parade ground, and family members weren't welcome. So I'm glad that has changed, and that was just one of the things. We've made sure that an insurance company finally did the right thing with the families about the compensation, the insurance payments. They weren't doing the right thing, and so and getting to know all the families. This morning, we've all been very busy on Facebook and Instagram, sending hugs, virtual hugs, and thinking of all of our children who are up in heaven looking at all of us and, pointing down at, look, there's my mom, there's my mom. So it's, while we can't be together, it's, thank God for technology.
Absolutely. And Karen, I mean, you talk about something that I think is just incredible, and it speaks to the resilience of our military personnel, their families, and their friends, which is that people can go through an experience as you did, and when you found things that were wrong with it, you didn't just move past it. You actually went back and fought to make it better. And so much of the support that people experience today when they lose a loved one in the military is thanks to work that you and Paul and others have done throughout the years. I mean, Paul, you had a story about that as well, just about the notification process that was taking place during Vietnam. You want to talk a little bit about that and about the leadership of Colonel Moore's wife?
Indeed. In 1965, the Battle of the Idrang Valley occurred with 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry on point, and a very new unit, a heliborne unit that had man-trained, equipped at Fort Benning, Georgia. And Hal Moore, Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore's wife, Julia, stayed behind with all the other wives. And during the Battle of Idrang Valley, a very high casualty event, the notifications came by yellow cab. Telegrams delivered by yellow cab to the new widow. And as you might expect, yellow cabs became a pariah. Nobody wanted to see them. And Julia Moore immediately said, those telegrams will come to me. I will take 1 or 2 spouses. I will take a chaplain. I will deliver the bad news. And I will comfort the family who is lost. And that activism, very much like Karen Meredith, was extremely important. 1, for the families of the lost, and 2, for the future of our armed forces and how to treat family members in a far more appropriate, polite, and respectful manner. The second component that I'd like to address, and to your question, on how to remember, the 1% of our warriors are fairly remote, and it is unlikely that the vast number of Americans will meet. And I stay in direct contact through my sons and daughter, who are all soldiers. Daughter is a veteran now, and I keep a directed telescope, as has been called in certain publications, into what's going on into the armed forces. I got a call one day from my younger son that a classmate of his, a man that I had met, a wonderful young infantry officer, had been grievously wounded, and I was able to visit him in a VA hospital nearby. Drew Jensen was a particularly brave man, and he survived several months before he and his wife made the collective decision that he would move on, and he did. I was able to attend his funeral, and the song played was "Over the Rainbow" by Brother Is, or Israel Kamea Kalele, and powerful song. It's never been the same for me since, and I would expect that folks might want to listen to the song, and if you are moved to it, remember Drew Jensen, wonderful young American, one of thousands we've lost in the last period since 9/11. And we can just, we can select somebody that we can remember every day. I have my father, I have Ken Ballard, I also have Drew Jensen, I also have Shannon Kent, who was a colleague of my older son, who was lost on mission as she was working with her language skills with and certain other skills with our special operating forces in Syria. So stay in touch. We are the 1%, and we can maintain our link through our young.
Absolutely. And that's, Paul, another, the Kent family, an example of people who have, taken Shannon Kent's memory and worked to make the process better for other families going through that same experience. I actually remember that from working in the Senate. They were a New York family, at least in part, and turned that sorrow into action. Now, Paul, I want to ask you another question. You served on active duty as a very senior leader in the Army, and you had to console families when they lost a loved one. So I was wondering if you could tell us what advice and guidance did you share in those moments with those families?
Thanks, Will. For all our lives, most soldiers on active duty will either participate in a ceremony for Memorial Day, or they will lead the ceremony. And the speeches vary, and they are all good. They all focus on and try to narrow the focus in on a particular event that created casualties or a particular person. We at Fort Benning had the great privilege of Robert Nett, Medal of Honor winner, that in combat operations as an infantryman during the Korean War. And he was always there for us. He was always the emotive speaker. And he would address, and he would select, and he would point out a story. Stories stay with us. You will remember a story. You will remember the story of Ken Ballard and Norm Eaton, and you will, it's just who we are. We're storytellers, and we don't have to be Irish to do it. And we just are. And so create the narrative, create the story, and place a memory.
Absolutely. Well said. Thanks, Paul. And the question that we keep getting from the audience in different forms is about how you take the memories of our fallen heroes and use that in everyday life. And we're not talking about politics here, but just in the way that we think about our responsibility as Americans and about civic engagement and defending our country in the way that our heroes did. How do you think about that, Karen, and how we should honor their memories with the way that we live our lives every day?
Well, I want to say, too, that the loss is not just the families, it's the brothers and sisters in arms. And I think about the guys that Ken served with. He was 1st Armored Division, and he was a tank commander. And I think about those young men that he served with for the 384 days that he was in Iraq. And I'm still in touch with some of them. Unfortunately, politics has gotten in the way with some of us, but that's okay. Others, we look beyond that. But it's just remembering that they knew Ken in a way that I didn't. And so to hear the stories that they tell me about him, but one of the things that parents are so worried about is that Ken will be forgotten. And that's what I do every day to make sure that I talk about him. He's still a part of my life. And I think there's some people that get worried that I'm talking about somebody who's dead, but he's my boy. And for people who know me, they welcome the Ken stories. And when we meet at Arlington on Memorial Day, I get to hear the Ken stories that many of them are not repeatable. But that's okay too. So I think just they say that people die twice, once when they take their last breath and once when the last person speaks their name. So I just want to make sure Ken has had a few little babies named after him. There's a Ballard and there's a Kenneth and there's a Michael, and so that's really nice to know that they've got big shoes to fill. But we have to remember not only the fallen, but the people that served with them, because for them it was such a big loss too.
Absolutely. Now, Paul and Karen, I want to end by asking you if either of you have a message for your fellow Americans who might be watching today about Memorial Day, final thoughts. Paul, we'll go to you first.
Karen, what you just said is memorable. And I would add to Will's question, the judicious use of force. The United States has had a quick reflex to use its military in ends that may have been unnecessary had we exhausted every other option available to the United States. War is a tool of last resort. And I will do a shout out to the chairman of VoteVets, a young colonel named John Soltz. And Soltz came back after serving as a tank commander in Iraq. He and I may have crossed paths. We were there at the same time. But he led a tank platoon, and he came back with the memory of a very poorly thought out process that led to the attack into Iraq, the second one. And he set out to help the armed forces of the United States by getting veterans elected to high office. That's why it was an easy decision to link arms with him years ago. And that's what we can do as every American, is to make sure that your congressman, that your representative, and your 2 senators feel what you feel, and that war is a tool of last resort, and don't be cavalier about threat or execution of warfare.
Very well said, Paul. Karen, anything you want to add? Final thoughts?
I think Paul said it perfectly. I was very pleased to get involved with VoteVets after John and I kind of connected on Facebook. He was there the same time in Iraq that Ken was. And so that was a good starting point. But for me, it's not the war necessarily, but it was our foreign policy. And John and I were on the same page that allowed me to continue my activism and to have a platform and to speak out. Don't send our troops anywhere without a strategy and without an exit plan. And I just so worry when people start talking about doing things and we don't have either of those on the table. So for whoever can support VoteVets in that way and do keep in touch with your member of Congress is really helpful. They really do have to listen to us. They do work for us. But I do want to thank VoteVets for giving us the opportunity today to let me talk about my boy and to let me talk about Memorial Day. I really appreciate it.
Very well said. Paul and Karen, I want to thank you both for joining us, for sharing your stories, for everything that you've done for our country and everything that you continue to do each and every day. We really appreciate it, and it's great to see you both.
Thank you, Will.
Now everybody can do barbecue.
Yes, now it's time for the barbecue. And thanks to you both. Today, we pause to reflect. And tomorrow, as you both mentioned, the work continues of honoring those fallen heroes with action and caring about the fate of this country just as much as they did. And we look forward to doing that work with each and every one of you. From all of us at VoteVets, thanks for all that you do. Thanks for watching. Take care, and we'll see you again very soon.